Well, good morning. Welcome to anyone who's new here this morning. We're glad that you're here. My name is Tim, and I spoke about a month ago, and if you were here, and I know it's summer, so it's kind of we come when we can, but if you were here about a month ago, you heard that my children were very, very concerned that I was qualified to do this particular job and actually preach. And I guess I impressed them because they after service, they no really any concerns about what I said. However, they did each one of them in their own special way said, "Dad, that was really, really, really long." And so today I'm going to be shorter, and it's really so that they can get back some of the time they lost last time. So this month, and we're talking about hesitating and following Jesus. And Pastor Brian asked me to talk a bit about hesitating to step. Our main scripture from the Gospel of Matthew it tells a story that probably most of you are very, very familiar with. It is the story of Jesus walking on water during the storm and welcoming the disciple Peter to join him on the water. Peter is certainly one of the more interesting disciples portrayed in the Newer Testament because, of course, he has a quick temper, impulsive behavior. He says whatever comes to his mind right away. And this story doesn't disappoint in this regard because Peter jumps out of the boat, walks a few steps on the water, and then, having second thoughts, starts to sink. Over the years, scholars have wondered and debated what's the meaning of this story? What's it trying to teach? What is Matthew trying to say? And we get all kinds of answers from the scholars. The commentators say all kinds of different things, and often they even disagree with each other. But there are two items that it seems like most of them agree on. And the first one is that this story about Peter jumping out of the boat is both a cautionary and encouraging story about how we might consider our own encounters with Jesus. At times we have lots of faith. We jump out of the boat. And at other times our faith, even when we're walking on the water, fails us and we start to sink. And it's only to be rescued by the merciful hand of Jesus. So that's one idea. The second idea is that this story tells us that Jesus is without question God. Matthew wants to tell us that Jesus is God of the entire universe. You see, Matthew's gospel was written to answer the question, how does Jesus and how does faith in Jesus and his life here on earth fit into the Jewish understanding of faith, especially in regards to the Hebrew Bible, what we as Christians call the Older Testament. In broad and general terms, Matthew's answer is that Jesus is not a replacement for the Hebrew Bible and the Hebrew faith, but rather Jesus, the person and God, is a fulfillment of God's plan for all of us, whether we're Jew or not. Okay, so today I want to focus on one small phrase in that familiar story that has a lot of theological significance for Matthew, the human author of our story. According to the story, the disciples are trying to cross a lake, which we know from other places in the Gospel of Matthew, that we're talking about the Sea of Galilee. Now, by Minnesota standards, and being summer, we're all thinking about lakes, right? By Minnesota standards, the Sea of Galilee is not that big of a deal. But in the Middle East, in the desert, this is a big lake. And it's really important. Now, the issue with the Sea of Galilee is that, again, by our Minnesota standards, the Sea of Galilee is relatively shallow. And so when the wind blows, it causes a lot of big waves. And those big waves in the ancient days were really very dangerous. So the disciples are struggling to get across the lake. They're struggling to cross the lake, wishing that outboard motors had been invented. And they think they see this ghost, and the ghost is walking towards them. And this is the part of the story I want to deal with, where Jesus says to them, to comfort them, to calm them down, when he approaches, he says, "Take heart. It is I. Don't be afraid." Now, for us today, this makes logical sense, and it's certainly comforting to think that Jesus still says to us, in the midst of our trials and tribulations, "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." The thing is, we miss something, or we can miss something, in this short statement by Jesus that Matthew's Jewish readers, the people that Matthew is writing to, would have immediately understood. And it's the second part of these words. It's the short phrase, "It is I." Now, Matthew is writing in Greek, the main language of the educated people at the time of Jesus' life, and he used a Greek phrase. And that Greek phrase is ego eimi. And you can see it up there in Greek and then in English. It is I. Now, this phrase, for you English majors out there, people who know English really well, is a combination of the first person pronoun I, the word ego, and the to be verb, eimi, in its present tense. So, it is I. Of course, anyone who has taken a psychology course, you've heard the word ego before, right? Ego means I, and you've heard that before. Now, you just have to remember that here, ego is the same word. It just doesn't have all the baggage that Freud added to it later on. Okay? So it's the same word. Okay, Tim. That's great. I came to church this morning, not English class. What's your point? Well, it's likely that the significance of what Matthew is saying here, the Jewish Matthew is saying, with using the Greek phrase ego eimi, is that this is a clear reference to the God of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, Matthew, using the Greek language in such a way, indicates to his original readers that Jesus is actually saying, he's not actually saying, "Don't worry, I'm here." Rather, he's saying, "Don't worry, I am God. Don't be afraid." Matthew's story, set in the deadly storm where nature is raging, demonstrates that Jesus is truly God, and a God who can control even the forces of nature. Don't worry. I am God. Don't be afraid. And this is who says to Peter, "Don't worry. Get out of the boat." Now, Matthew's Jewish readers would have likely been very familiar with the Hebrew Bible. These would be people who knew what we call the Old Testament really well. And this story that Matthew tells would have probably reminded them of a story in their Bible. Remember, Matthew is not part of their Bible yet. It's not been put together into the Bible. It would have reminded them of a story in Exodus chapter 3. Now, Exodus chapter 3 has the story of Moses and the burning bush. And again, probably many of you have heard this story many, many times. It's the story of how Moses, as he was a shepherd, looks and sees a bush that's burning. And it's burning, but it's not being burnt up. And he goes to investigate. And upon further investigation, it turns out that the burning bush was gone, showing up to tell Moses that it was his job or his opportunity to lead the Jewish slaves in Egypt to freedom. Now, Moses is not excited about this. He's not excited about this opportunity. And so he comes up with a bunch of excuses. And each one, God says, "No, I don't accept that. I don't accept it." So then, in a move of desperation, Moses says to God, "You know, I'm going to have to get these people to listen to me. Okay? If you're sending me, I've got to get them to listen to me. And one of the things that they're going to ask me is, who's this God you're talking about? Who are you talking about? Who's God? So, Moses says, I need to know your proper name. I need to know your real name, so that I can tell them that you are the one who sent me. Now, Moses is figuring that God isn't going to tell him his name, God's name. Because in that culture, sharing your name with someone was a very, very personal thing to do. So Moses thinks he's kind of tricked God. Surprising Moses, however, God obliges and says, my name is Yahweh. Now, some of you have perhaps heard this name of God before, the name Yahweh. And in some old Bibles, some old English Bibles, they actually use the German pronunciation of this name, and the name is Jehovah. Yahweh and Jehovah are exactly the same name in Hebrew. It's just translated a little bit differently. Now, the thing that's important to Matthew and to us, however, is that the name Yahweh is a Hebrew version of the words, you guessed it, I am. So much later, when the translators of the Hebrew Bible and the story in Exodus are translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the language that Matthew would have known and was reading when he was writing his gospel, they used a variation on our Greek words, ego eimi, to translate God's name. Now, in both Greek and Hebrew, there is something really significant about this phrase, because it's that to be verb. Okay, Tim, come on. It's not English class, it's summertime. Let's get to the point here, right? The point is that when God says, I am, God's not just talking about the present. The significance of I am is that God is also talking about the future as well as the past. So when Moses asks God, God, will you be with me in the future? God answers, I am. When Moses asks, God, were you with me in the past? God answers, I am. You see, for an infinite God, God is always present. Present now, present in the future, present in the past. So when Jesus says to Peter, I am, get out of the boat, Peter doesn't hesitate, because God is the present God of all times. It's only when Peter stops, looks at the waves, thinks about the future without God, that he starts to sink. He forgets that God is as real in the future as he is in the present. This is the same image that's presented in our second reading, Psalms 23. The psalmist reminds us that no matter where we are, God is with us. In the peaceful place of pastoral rest, God is with us. In the valley of darkness, and some of you probably memorized this as the valley of death, God is there. When we are surrounded by people who mean us harm, God is there. It is a statement of God's past, present, and future reality. No matter the circumstances, God is there. This does not mean that challenging times won't come. But when they do come, we are not alone, for God is with us. Sometimes we have this wrong idea, and I don't really know where it came from, but sometimes there's this idea that if we're Christians, that somehow if we as Christians are following what God wants, bad things aren't going to happen to us. But that's actually not biblical at all. The Bible is clear: when bad times come, and they will, God is there. Now, one of my favorite times here at Centennial is during our Kids 2 services. And so next week at our Kids 2 service, we will do this. When we say the new creed together, and it starts, "We are not alone." And every time I hear those words, and it's happening right now, I've got chills going up and down my arms. The idea, the reminder that God is here. We are not alone. So God is the ever-present reality in our lives. There's no need to hesitate. No need to stop and think about jumping out of the boat, because God is always with us. I'd like to invite you, if you would like, at this moment, as we're sort of closing this part of the service, to close your eyes if you'd like, take a deep breath, and I'd like you to think about the next few things that I say. Listen as God says. In your financial challenges, I am. In your sickness, I am. In your relationships, I am. In this crazy, messed up world, I am. I am closer than your breath because I gave it to you. I am the resurrection. I am truth. I am life.